For everyone with an interest in NASH or more broadly fatty liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 4, Episode 19 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami. Our look back at last week's public comment session on the ICER report on Resmetirom and Obeticholic acid starts now.
This week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
The purpose of the discussion wasn't a big picture approach to how we solve the issue of fatty liver disease. It was a narrow look at whether these drugs are worth it in terms of fighting the disease.
The results were, I literally fell off my chair.
The very first gold star that you can get is if you can not get sicker while you try to deal with it.
If you factor the cost of a biopsy into the cost of diagnosing a patient, you've just driven the cost of diagnosis through the roof.
When you're trying to be as precise and regimented as a process as ICER have here, this is not a disease that fits that spectrum.
Every week, a global community of fatty liver disease stakeholders comes together to explore the most important challenges in diagnosing, treating, and developing medications for patients with fatty liver diseases. Join liver wellness advocate Louise Campbell, pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, and their guests, patients and patient advocates Mike Betel, Wayne Eskridge, and Tony Villiotti, as they discuss the April 29th ICER and Midwest CPAC public comments session on obeticholic acid and resmetirom on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
We have with us an esteemed and august collection of patient advocates. We have Louise, who advocates. Hey, Louise, how are you this week?
I'm very well, thank you very much. Nice to see the guys.
We were commiserating over the last couple of days that we could have the two most disappointing football teams in the Premier League, respectively, but mine is worse than hers. And then we have, in alphabetical order, my last name, Mike Betel. Mike, how are you today?
Excellent. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us. And Wayne Eskridge. Hi, Wayne.
Hey, Roger. Good to be here.
Greetings. Good to have you. And then finally, I guess at V, you're last in the alphabet a lot, but Tony Villiotti. Tony, how are you today?
I'm doing very well, Roger. Thank you.
Okay, that's excellent. So today's episode is something of a follow-up on the episode that we did recently with Jeff McIntyre and Pam Donaher from Turns, where we talked about the draft of the ICER paper on resmetirom and obeticholic acid. In the aftermath, like this past Friday, they collected public comments, and we have with us three of the folks who delivered public comments as part of that. This episode, we'll talk a little bit about how that came to be, how you view the document, what you said, why you chose to say that, and then we'll go on from there in whatever directions we do. But first, groundbreaker. One good thing, personal or professional, that's happened in your life in the past week. Brave one, go first.
I'll speak on behalf of my son who came home with a 95 in a science test. When you're in grade 10, that's a good one. So help raise his mark. I'm going with that one today.
I'd go with that one, although that might make for a more expensive college that he gets into, but you'll deal with that later.
one test at a time.
Yeah, okay, good. Next.
Well, I give it a shot. The Fatty Liver Foundation has recently released the State of NASH Care in America, which is taking a snapshot from the patient perspective of what experiences they have. And we just opened it up, but we hit our first 200 people taking the survey, so that was a milestone.
That's fantastic, Wayne. How many are you looking to get by the end of the survey?
We hope to get 2,000 at a total.
Well, that's a good start. It's an excellent start. Tony, go ahead.
It's one of my hobbies is writing articles about the National Football League draft, which just occurred this past weekend. So that was kind of the highlight of my past week, watching the draft and writing some articles about it.
That's interesting. I've heard two comments about the draft I find interesting. One is that it is the ultimate Christmas holiday for football fans. Everybody gets a present. It might not be the gift you wanted. It might not turn out to be a gift, but everybody walks away feeling like they got something. And as a Philadelphia native, I got to tell you that everyone in Philadelphia thinks we absolutely stole the show. And I don't know whether you think that's right or not. I know the first one's right. How did the Eagles do?
Yeah, that's a good summary of the interest in the draft. And yeah, the Eagles seem to do very well.
Steelers did okay, too. It was a good day in Pennsylvania. For those of us who live in the States, or if you don't live in the States, understand that Tony and I live in the same state, even though we're 5 hours apart. And Louise, with that, you're up.
Oh, I suppose my good thing for the week is is getting on a flight at the end of it to fly to Perth, Australia. A good day of relaxing where nobody can contact me because I choose not to use the internet on the phone. So I enjoy being pampered and taken care of.
Don't tell anybody what day that is, and maybe you'll get away with 2 or 3 days of no contact. I guess my news is professional, which is that we've announced that we will once again be media partners with EASL for the EASL Congress, and later in the year, the NAFLD Summit. If it's still called the NAFLD Summit by then, I don't know how this nomenclature conference is going to affect things like that. But we will, in fact, 2 weeks hence, have Alexander Krag and Sven Franke from EASL to come on and talk about that conference at a high level. On the second week in June, after the abstracts have been published, we'll have an abstract review. We'll be doing at least 2 daily one-on-ones from Vienna. And Mike, I might be looking for a sideman because Louise is going to be in Perth.
Oh, love to help.
At least one day, I'd love to have you come to the party with us. And then we'll be doing 1 or 2 episodes afterwards. Very exciting stuff. And I think it's going to be a fantastic conference. So I think I'd like to start. I asked Tony this question. And how did you come to give commentary and be involved in the events of last Friday, each of you?
I had interacted with ICER in the previous version when they studied OCA. So they reached out to me and asked me if I would be an interviewer for this one. And then when they announced that they were having patient advocates to speak, then I volunteered for that and became part of that panel. So I've sort of been engaged with the ICER thing for a while and had an opportunity to slip into that 5-minute slot. So it was, kind of a continuation, I suppose.
I can go next. It's Wayne's fault that I participated because he asked me in a conversation we were all having about ICER, and he said, well, you're giving a testimony, right? And I go, what? So why would they want me anyway? And then I looked into it and I asked, and I guess was there 5 of us, I think, that ended up testifying. So
in my case, I was contacted by ICER late last year. They wanted to interview me about my experience as a patient. And, I did that, participated in a couple of discussions. And then subsequently, they asked me to be one of the speakers at the public input hearing.
So had each of the 3 of you done anything like that before with ICER or elsewhere? Or is this a new experience?
I have not.
I have not.
Yeah, I hadn't testified, but I had interviewed with them at their previous session.
Okay, so I guess the place to start would be to ask what your feelings were about the draft document before we get into what did you say and why did you choose to handle it the way that you did. We did an episode on that here, but I'd be intrigued in your reactions.
Well, that was a hard document, I thought. There's a lot of challenges to doing a price analysis when the prices aren't known. I was unhappy with some of the prices they used in their model. I didn't feel great about the document that I saw, so I was a little bit critical of the process.
Well, critical of the process and the document are 2 different things. We'll come back and talk about all that in a minute, but other reactions to the document first, Mike, Tony?
I'm going to talk about it later. I know it's the other discussion point, but what stood out for me was the lack of empathy towards patients and the journey that they have to go through and the struggles that they have to go through and how difficult it is to manage your own treatment and, how important having options like these treatments are. I think that's what stuck with me. And as Donna talked about it a bit, that there was a lot of generalization as well, that all patients are the same and react the same and go through the same type of experience. So that's really not the case.
Okay. And Tony, your thoughts?
Yeah, I kind of mixed reactions to the document itself. On the positive side, I was pleased they didn't include some patient input information into the verbiage of the document. I was very disappointed, though, in the economic analysis that they did. I thought they were really off base on the inputs they used. The source of those inputs was a study that excluded the vast majority of the population, including the people that were most affected. And the lack of empathy that Mike mentioned really rang through to me as well. That was less in the document and more in the actual discussion of the document during a session.
Thanks, Tony. That was going to be my question. The document itself didn't strike me as something that was supposed to be empathetic. If you heard the episode, then I had significant problems with the document. I thought it was using data that was too old, and in some cases just flat out, they made statements that were wrong.
Roger, so why did they include a whole section about what the patient's feedback was? Like that, to me, that seemed like their attempt to be empathetic and to say, hey, we listened to the patients. This is what they said.
I'd have to ask them that question. It was a bit of a surprise to me that they did that in the first place. I mean, I don't know, Louise, you can talk more about experiences dealing with NICE, which is a different thing, but in some ways similar. I guess, Mike, maybe the truth is that I had enough problems with their data points. I mean, if you heard the episode, it's like I read the first sentence where they said that a quarter of the population has NAFLD, which is a 5-year-old number, and it's been rapidly progressing, and then talking about how the disease was asymptomatic. And I kind of felt like I was in one of those roller coaster rides where instead of creeping up to the top slowly and then the ride starts, where they buckle you in and you take off at 60 miles an hour. And I was like, whoa, I don't know what this ride is, but I don't know where the ground is. So I guess I might have gotten lost enough in the numbers that I didn't get to that. But so, Tony, you made a comment about empathy in the discussion. How did that work? What did that look like?
Well, the thing that jumped out at me and that really, kind of set me off is there were a series of questions that they've asked and voted on during a session. And one of the questions was, if a drug was approved, what would be and I'm paraphrasing here, what would be the impact on a caregiver? There were 15 voting members at this meeting. 6 of those members, which is 40% of the voters, said it would have no impact on a caregiver's life. And I found that astounding. Everyone on this broadcast knows the impact this disease has not only on a patient, but on the patient's family and those that support the patient. I was kind of glad I wasn't in the room, I guess, when they went in through that part of it.
That's an interesting perspective. Hey, Wayne, you're smiling.
Well, the thing that set me off was basically they were insisting that this was not a progressive disease. F1 and F2 had no significance to patients, and that really bothered me. So that was the main thrust of the thing that got my goat, I guess, is that the consequences of rising fibrosis was just dismissed as a non-event.
Louise was the person who educated me a long time ago, A, on depression, and B, on the issue of presenteeism. And I think presenteeism starts to present itself, early in the disease. You don't have to get out to advanced fibrosis to have a problem around presenteeism and quality of life scores. It struck me, now I'm thinking about lack of empathy differently. While they had data available to them, it doesn't seem to me that they took advantage of it or understood it properly. And Wayne, I'm totally tracking with you on that. Louise, before we get into the actual testimony that folks gave and why they gave that and how they felt about the process that day, any questions you want to ask or comments you want to make?
You've commented on empathy, and I think it's a vital part of all healthcare. Did you feel that when you met for the second time, or this panel last Friday, that you felt there was more empathy? Had they listened to the concerns raised before? And did you get a sense of any further insight? Because the only people who say it doesn't affect caregivers are people who aren't caregivers, have never been caregivers, or don't see themselves in that paradigm, ever being in that situation. So therefore they can't be empathetic.
I really didn't see that there was any particular empathy built there. It was a very businesslike situation, I believe, of preparing arguments for the insurance companies is how I felt about it. It really wasn't patient focused. It was setting an argument set for the insurance companies and the payers to be able to make decisions and have somebody to blame for the decisions they made.
Yeah, I was going to say your use of the phrase argument set is highly descriptive in that context. Argument set for the insurance companies has a very clear, distinctive connotation and direction to it. I think that's probably right, by the way.
And I think that's where you then bring in, I thought they might have moved their position slightly from when they first published the document, but it sounds like they didn't. If you are going to make an argument for insurance companies, then there's enough data that suggests that even for the initial diagnosis of NAFLD or NASH, that the average patient within the US system costs £1,700 additional cost just to get to that diagnosis. So from insurance perspective, you need to use those arguments, and they didn't seem to be in the document that I saw. And in fact, that document was, you can't have an FDA outcome that's regression if you don't have a progressive disease. So how can you have when they determined it wasn't a progressive disease? So they didn't really strike me as they knew the topic that they were reviewing, other than 2 medications.
I felt that my impression looking back was that the clinicians, the physicians, were way more positive than the others on the call, right? And, we can talk about the votes after if you want, but there was one that struck me the most, but there was 15 people that voted on a couple of them. And I was like, whoa, the results literally fell off my chair.
Other comments, or should we let Mike talk about what drove him off his chair? Okay, Mike, what propelled you groundward?
Why did I fall off my chair? One of the questions that got me, and then there was the follow-up, of course, is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of resmetirom is superior to that provided by lifestyle management alone? So my interpretation of the question is, do you think that the drug is offering any benefit over doing nothing except the lifestyle management? That's what they're asking, right? So for that one, it was 8-7, barely in favor of treatment. And that wasn't bad enough. So then they did it again and they asked the question again with obeticholic acid. And it was 14-1. No, like 14-1.
Yeah.
I don't know. You're not falling off your chair, Roger. I don't know.
No. Right now I'm moderating. If I betray emotion while moderating, it gets really ugly really fast. So we'll come back to that in a second.
Well, I'd like to comment on that because
Please go ahead.
I was offended really by those votes. I couldn't believe that they actually came to that conclusion because, it was basically saying if we approve this drug, then what people will do is take this instead of the standard of care, which is lifestyle. And nobody ever says that. I mean, it's insane to say, well, we're not going to tell you to change your weight and your lifestyle since we have this pill. So that was the implication of that vote, is that this would replace standard of care rather than be an aid to the patient going through that same lifestyle journey.
I'll defend that slightly and say that there is some history, for example, with statins, of a significant number of patients taking statins and deciding as a result they did not need to change their diet. So there is that piece of history. Now, these drugs, go back to the first time I ever spoke to this community, which was in NASH in 2019. These drugs are so different than statins in so many different ways, you can't define it. And I would not make that statement about this class of drugs. But if someone said to me, it's just like the statins, I would say, well, no, it's not. But that could be where they were coming from on that issue.
Well, there are certainly going to be people that treat it that way, but that's certainly not the way that we as patient advocates would argue for it. It's not the way that physicians would argue for it. There will be people that do it, but it's not the role that we want them to take.
I completely agree with you. Okay, now having said that about the statins, I completely agree with you. And I think that it's fallacious. It's bogus. There's another word that begins with B that has 8 letters in it. That's the one I want to use, but I'm not. To say that for a disease that has been this starved for medication for this long, people are going to take the disease and otherwise go on with their lives as it were. Or let me amend that. Otherwise, go back to bad diets and bad habits or never adopt good ones because now they've got a drug. That just doesn't fit this disease. That would be about lack of empathy. But back at where could data come from? I can see where someone could get there, but they'd be wrong, right?
I suppose for me, it raises the question of rephrasing that question to say something along the line of, if you were to invest the same amount of money in lifestyle and changes and for the patients that you invest in the drugs, would the outcome of the drug be beneficial? That is a totally different question because we do not invest the same level of resources into saying, change your lifestyle, let's give you psychologists, let's give you dietetics, let's give you exercise programs, as we do when we develop these medications. So I think we're starting from a backward position. And I think the guys are right. Both medications have been shown to be efficacious, but they are not going to be for everybody, and we do want to promote lifestyle. So we do have to invest in that if we're not going to have to invest multiple billions just in a pill. We need to get a plethora of options, but we need to invest all the way up the system from that. So I think the questions do need to be rephrased in a comparative world, but we don't have a comparative world.
Louise, I think my own perspective, and I'd be interested in what you guys think, is that the reframing of the question is it certainly isn't a U.S. point of view. Because in the U.S., people are going to spend, people are going to spend a lot of money on the drugs anyway, regardless of what they do with lifestyle and other issues. So it doesn't wind up becoming a where is the better place to spend your dollars. It becomes what's the incremental benefit of doing it. Now, we get back into my frustration with judging everything by biopsy, which is if in fact we can stop progression of disease so that over time, patients' level of fibrosis will stop where it is, and that's all we do, is that a benefit worth paying for? And I think to me, and I'm going to guess everybody on this call, the answer would be yes. But that's because we see it as a progressive disease and we see the endpoint as being really nasty. If you view this data as if you didn't get your 1 level regression of fibrosis in 12 months, you didn't succeed on the drug, then they're going to view an awful lot of patients as having failed. I think that's part of what we call ultimately the psychosis and straitjacket and the yoke of biopsy, which is if you look at this through biopsy window, I think it underplays the benefit of the drug itself for patients.
Yeah, I thought it was crazy that they put the biopsy in as their standard analysis because there's nobody going to do biopsies of the average patient.
It would curb the uptake of the drugs when they're approved, but who's going to want to go for a biopsy for this treatment.
Mike, I heard Wayne say two things, and that was one of them. Here's the other one. If you factor the cost of a biopsy into the cost of diagnosing a patient, you've just driven the cost of diagnosis through the roof. So the economics of that are crazy. And there I agree totally with Wayne. I think what I keep hearing at least, is that what insurers are likely to do is hold the indication to label, but not require a biopsy. If there's another means of testing that's proven adequate, which is why it's so important that all these guidelines have come out and advocated the same pathway that does not include biopsy, and why it's so important that Nimble, Litmus, Goldmine, Nail, and IT are all in the business of demonstrating that we can get to strong and robust diagnoses without ever going to a biopsy. You're right, patients won't do it. And by the way, if they do it, it blows the cost structure completely out of the water.
Plus, how long is it going to take to see patients? What's the waiting time going to be for a biopsy?
It was even kind of suggested by one of the speakers that maybe you should have a biopsy before one of the drugs was prescribed, which is obviously a notion that doesn't make any sense. But just in terms of the discussion, I mean, the purpose of the discussion wasn't a big picture approach to how we solve the issue of fatty liver disease. It was a narrow look at whether these drugs are worth it, in terms of fighting the disease.
But then I'll go back to Wayne's point, which is that if you have to get somebody a biopsy before you prescribe the drug, then you've changed worth it rather dramatically.
Yeah, no question.
The comment you made about whether or not stopping the progression is of value to the patient. And I can tell you that that's the very first gold star that you can get, is if you can not get sicker while you try to deal with it. There's not a patient out there that would say that that's a bad thing and that it's not worth stopping that, even though that's all it did, while it gave me the opportunity to actually perfect my lifestyle response. That would be a benefit to patients that would really help them, because it takes time and it's hard and we have a lot to learn. So if we could confidently feel like we weren't losing ground every day, that's a great boost to the morale of a patient.
Agreed. And right now, the way the results of trials are stated, that's defined as failure. Tony, or Mike, when you talk about lack of empathy in the whole system, that's actually the first place I go, is that the way we score trial results right now is extremely mechanistic and unappreciative. And Louise, I heard a comment the other day I'm going to ask you to comment on. But the idea basically was that Hep C, you could clear the inflammation in 12 weeks and see a real difference, but fibrosis didn't respond for 2 to 3 years, or fully respond for 2 to 3 years. And here, in a case where we're not hitting inflammation as hard, we're expecting fibrosis to respond in 12 months. And that's just not realistic or sensitive to the disease or the effect on the patients.
Yeah, I think you've got that generally right. We would fibroscan our patients 3 months, 6 months, and 1 year post-treatment. And you do see quite rapid regression. But like any liver condition, some people go on to develop a second condition. So if you use the example of hepatitis C, some of those patients would then go on to develop fatty liver. So you then compound one liver injury with another. And particularly in hepatitis C genotype 3, which predominates fat within the liver anyway. So you can have lots of different issues. Removing and changing liver health from one condition does not necessarily mean you're immune to another one. So I think liver health as a per se is more than just one disease entity. Coming to ICER in particular on this report, their premise was this was a non-progressive disease. So therefore, not stopping disease progression was not even in the frame of thinking. We commented on how old a lot of the data was that they used. I just wonder whether or not a lot of the references to where fatty livers sat in our knowledge base in the late sort of 20 or the noughties, for example, is very much where this is based. We didn't think it progressed. We called it benign. We didn't think it had too many symptoms. So a lot of what I read and have listened to the gentleman talk about is stuff that we have gone on to know more as a field. So therefore, we know it's progressive. We know it is strongly effective on people's symptoms, but not every single person has the same symptom. It's extremely heterogeneous. It's probably one of the most difficult conditions to nail down. And when you're trying to be as precise and regimented as a process as ICER have here, this is not a disease that fits that spectrum. So therefore, you lose empathy, you lose knowledge, and you're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. That's very much the sense I got from here. The only benefit that we can say when you watch progressive removal of liver diseases and health conditions is you watch the cardiac indexes improve, you watch the diabetes improve. So therefore, until we really see this in the real world situation, ICER may always feel that this is a non-progressive and therefore non-regressive disease, but it's related conditions that it really benefits. So I think it's flawed.
Louise, like I and it hasn't come up a lot in these discussions, but I really love that you're really relating the liver damage to other organs too. So it is a multi-system type of involvement. So when somebody is just measuring the impact of the liver, they're going, well, the liver's getting worse or the liver's getting better. But what about all of the other involvements, like the kidney, as an example, or the brain or the heart, right? All of those other issues are impacted as well. And even sleep apnea is a huge industry on its own, so there are these interrelationships too. So they were not taken into account at all. It was just really just about the liver side of it from what I have seen.
But that's very much what medicine does. We silo. The body never silos an organ. It crosstalks all of the time, but we silo health into particular niches. And that's one of the problems when you come for anything. It's a regimented question. I have Ian Rowe in my head saying they are only going to be answering one point.
And that's nice, where the process is a lot better known and more widely understood. And then I go back to one of your favorite Donna Cryer moments, turning to Vlad Rotsiu and saying, if I'm dead, I don't care what killed me. So I want to go to the specific testimonies that each of you gave and why you chose to approach it in the way you did and what you think the import of your testimony was. Mike, I listened to yours most recently, so I'll probably ask you to go first.
Sure. I gave the example, although I had NAFLD myself and was able to clear it through those lifestyle management approaches, my daughter had NASH and took an extreme solution, which isn't for everybody, and that was the gastric bypass. And I thought and was really frustrated by the fact that the document really made light of solutions like bariatric surgery, saying, oh, lifestyle management or bariatric surgery are other alternatives. And it's like, okay, it takes months and months of work to be able to even get worked up to be able to do the surgery. Then you have to go through basically a lifetime commitment to the way you eat and drink and everything. On top of that, for my daughter's situation, although she did eliminate the NASH and half her body weight, she then had to have her gallbladder removed. And then again, just last week, she had complications because of the gallbladder involvement with bile and stuff. And so it just goes on and on and on. And who knows what the future is. And I did read a lot lately. The gallbladder is involved in a lot of this. So that's where my take was. And I really wanted to share the personal side of it, saying that this is not an easy journey. It's not like, well, if we don't give them the medication, they can just take care of it on their own. It's just not that easy. And as we talked about earlier today as well, that was the focus of what I talked about.
Yeah, the thing that I found most compelling in your comment is the thing you just went back to, which is not just that your daughter, had surgery, liver improved, lost half her weight. Okay, if the story ends there, that's one story. When you go on to gallbladder and ongoing complications, that's very different because it says the story never ends.
I don't know the ending yet. Hopefully it's good.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, so alphabetical order. Wayne, why did you choose to comment on it that way?
Well, I focused on their position of this was a non-progressive disease because my personal experience, I turned out to be a fast progressor myself. I went from an F2 to an F4 in 5 years. It became evident to me as I learned more about it that was quite a dangerous place for me. So their minimizing of the progressive aspects of it really caught my attention. So I basically focused on trying to give some examples of this is progressive. It is a disease that, although very subtle, our problem is that the symptoms are so subtle in the early stages. And we usually write them off as, well, that's just what getting older feels like. Lose your fatigue and your sleep problems and the gastro problems that you just develop over the years. We just write that off to being older. And in many cases, it's really symptomatic of progressing liver disease. So that was my focus. I wanted to complain about the biopsy, about the costs that they were using. The primary focus was just to comment about the nature of progression. And they really were offended by my use of the Paul Angulo study, which did a hazard ratio comparison of mortality. The odds ratio of mortality between diabetes and stage 1, stage 2, and smoking. And that data says that those are more hazardous to your overall life extent than is diabetes or smoking. And they gave me a lot of pushback about that.
Wayne, remind me, at the time you were diagnosed, were you living with diabetes, type 2 diabetes as well, or not?
No, I've never had diabetes. I just have a pure NASH. I had a gallbladder out, but no other organ systems involved.
Okay, because the reason I ask is because sitting stacked up on my desk of my academic papers to take a look at is something that came out of Rohit Lumba's group in San Diego recently, suggesting that for a type 2 diabetic, one level progression of NASH could take 4 years, not the 7 that people have always talked about. So at that point, 2 to 5 doesn't become such a crazy fast progression for people with diabetes. Now, you're still a fast progressor, but Wayne, I've always thought of you as an overachiever.
Yeah, that's great. But Lumba's paper was really good. I think that's really so important information that people need to know because so many of us have diabetes, and that puts a different clock on things, and that's important.
Yeah, and by the way, I didn't notice in the ICER paper that they said the disease is not progressive except in diabetics. As you said, it's not progressive. Back at using old data or wrong impressions. Tony.
Yeah, my focus, and I guess this is from my background as a numbers guy, I focus more on the economic side of the paper. And my concern was if they got the cost-benefit analysis wrong, then what they were doing was kind of a waste. And the thing I did was I started looking at the citations they had for their inputs to the economic model. And the article that they based a lot of their inputs on, I discovered was very flawed. It was based on only people under 65 years of age. And there's a study by Dr. Yanasi that showed in the United States that about 3/4 of the spending on advanced liver disease is for people over 65. So that excluded the vast portion of the population. That was compounded by the fact they only considered people who had commercial private insurance. And that excluded anybody on Medicaid. So they really based their numbers on a very narrow slice of the population. I didn't mention this in my talk, but the thing that jumped out at me, it was almost like, using a biopsy to evaluate the liver. They were just taking a narrow slice of data. I also thought they got wrong the cost of a transplant. When this was mentioned in the questions that followed my presentation, the guy said, well, maybe it was wrong, but it really doesn't make a difference. Well, that doesn't speak well to the economic model. If you can get something wrong by a factor of 2 and it has no impact on your answer. So my comments as a retired CPA were more on the economic side.
Can I ask a dumb question here? If you don't know the cost of the drug, is it a pointless exercise anyway? Because neither company have said what the cost of their medication is going to be. And it was based on old costings. Is that my understanding?
That's what they did. They kind of assumed a cost that may or may not have any bearing in reality. So I agree. What's the point?
So it was a pointless economic evaluation in the first place.
You could certainly say that.
Yeah, I guess in theory, you could argue that it gives people a clue as to how to evaluate whatever prices they're thinking of charging against the model that will be used to evaluate it. I don't know if anybody had in mind, but
what do they do for other drugs that are soon to be approved? Do they also, I think they generally do pharmacoeconomic estimates.
Yeah, but because there are no drugs approved in this disease, and because OCA is improved for PBC at $75,000 a year, whatever the number is, or more than that now, it becomes very hard to figure out where to plant the flag. So I think in that regard, they had a unique challenge. Now, why do this analysis before you know the prices? That's an interesting question. And Louise, there the answer is if you're trying to put your thumb on the scale and tip people in favor of don't charge more than this, and by the way, if charge as little as you can, maybe that makes sense. But when you do that with so many flawed assumptions, I don't know who carries those assumptions forward. Back at Tony's point, if you do it right, well, let's try it this way. If missing on the cost of transplant by a factor of 2 doesn't matter in this analysis, is there a drug price at which it would matter? Because if it wouldn't matter at any drug price, then you get to a pointless exercise badly done. What's the old Woody Allen line about bad food in small portions? Pointless analysis done badly. But if they're trying to put their thumb on the scale of what are people going to charge, what will Madrigal charge, more specifically, I think. Because I've said this on this podcast before, I think the pricing issues around OCA are really very challenging for them.
I think it's interesting. It takes me back. If we look at figures in the UK, for example, if you look at the F2 and above fibrosis and the cost that's worked out here, that cost per year, I think, was around about 2.5 million. But not looking for the other the numbers in the F1s and below, the cost to society was 19 million. So we're looking to treat the ones who actually cost healthcare the least, because we're not looking for the ones who cost healthcare the most, which are the ones with the mild disease. And I think it was Wayne that mentioned a lot about the different levels of fibrosis having but greater impact than diabetes. Then that to me brings us back to what we're looking at. My figures, it wasn't millions, it was billions. So it was about 2.5 billion in the higher group and 19 billion in the group that we're not looking for healthcare costs that were attributed. So that, for me, sways the economic argument of who we should be putting these medications in for and where we should be helping. So the lower end to stop progression on a non-progressive disease, according to ICER.
To me, the best news about all this, by the way, is that it will have no impact on the FDA. The ICER documents are not something the FDA takes into consideration.
But I think that's a benefit. If this affects the FDA, then I'd be really concerned, given
that was my point. We agree. It's just not a well-done analysis. I mean, FDA will be interesting.
But it is being used by the payer to have pushback about what they'll pay for and what they won't and who they deny. And I think that's the bigger concern. I agree it won't affect FDA, but it certainly will enter into the discussions about price, about who pays and how much and who gets covered and who doesn't.
On May 19th, I think, are the three of us also participating in the FDA meeting as well? Wayne and Tony?
I haven't been invited.
Yes, I am. The whole family is participating.
So Gina was able to get this one on her calendar, and she sent me a note saying that she wasn't able to get ICER on her calendar. So you and Betsy went.
She will be talking at the FDA hearing.
And Mike, will you?
Yes, but we only have 3 minutes on the next one. So we have to be briefer.
Does this experience affect at all what either of you would say in that setting?
Yeah, I'm actually talking about something different, although I guess some of it was mentioned at the ICER one too, that from my perspective, I know Wayne and Tony don't know yet because we didn't have a discussion about it yet, but I believe that the decision to be treated regardless of side effects, unless they're deadly side effects, if the adverse events are tolerable, then it's up to the patient and the physician to work together to decide if that medication is good for the patient. I don't think the FDA has to make a decision on approval based on the adverse events, again, unless they're life-threatening.
That's interesting. Okay. Tony?
Yeah, my comments at FDA will be actually completely different than my comments to ICER, because I won't be talking about economics. What I'll be focused on, actually a little similar to Mike, is that right now people, this isn't a laboratory experiment. People aren't putting their disease on pause while we take time to study these drugs. There are people who are sitting there seeing their disease advance, and some people are dying, some people are getting transplants, and they need a solution now. And it doesn't need to be a perfect solution. If it's a solution that helps people either stop progression or just avoid a transplant, that's a good thing. And that the side effects are something each patient with their doctor needs to evaluate. People get itchy even without these drugs when they have liver disease. So I'll be focused more on that kind of thing.
And Tony, and the cardiovascular side effects can, from what I understand, be managed with other medications anyway, right? So
my sense, Mike, was that once you take the patient cohort out, the LDL issue tends to go away, either because it's taking statins or because it just resolves.
It's a longer term. Yeah, I read that.
That was a question in 2019, but now they've been following patients 3 years longer, and that just doesn't emerge as some kind of issue. That's interesting. First of all, I couldn't agree with you more.
You sounded surprised, so that's why I was wondering.
So 12 years ago, right, when I had my second round of adjuvant melanoma, they gave me 2 doses of Yervoy, and the itching with Yervoy was about as bad as anything I could imagine, pruritus being for this drug, all over my body, fairly relentless. And I was willing to keep going. Eventually, my adrenal system took a hit, and my blood pressure dropped to 80/60, and I was falling asleep standing up, and I said, I can't do that. But the itching, I was willing to tolerate. That's why I said that's interesting. Now, if you think this is a non-progressive disease, the answer is we're very afraid of cancer, right? But we should be equally afraid of this, going back to progressive, non-progressive. Has the agency ever, has the agency ever taken a position on that issue? Progressive, non-progressive disease? Have they ever had to?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. So closing round, let's assume that ICER as an entity were capable of learning from this experience and the feedback they got from you guys. What one thing would each of you like them most to learn or think about differently next time? Brave one, go first.
I'd be happy to go first. One of the things that jumped out at me that hopefully they will learn from is that of the people voting, I think think only one of them was a person who dealt with patients that have liver disease. I think when we're evaluating a drug like this, you really need to have more people involved who understand the patient's point of view and have actually dealt with the disease in their practice. I think a lot of what kind of came through to me was that these people were almost all the voters were dealing with it in the abstract and not in the real world. And hopefully that they can learn from that.
One of the things that I think it needs to be more real world, and we didn't particularly talk about this, but they evaluated these drugs as though they're lifetime. You're going to take these for a lifetime. And I think that that's not a realistic way to approach an analysis. You're really not going to do that. You're going to evaluate it at some point and you're going to make decisions down the road. So I think that it's appropriate to have some extended period perhaps, but I don't think lifetime makes a lot of sense on these analyses.
I don't know if this would make a difference or not. And I was listening carefully what Tony was saying too, that we knew who was going to be in that panel beforehand. I wonder if spending a little bit of time getting to know or researching who the different people in the panel were and sort of rereading through that lens what we were saying to them to see if that would hit home or not. We would normally do that if we were having an important meeting. And I'm thinking, I didn't really think about the audience. I generalized the group and just, it's Midwest CPAC and ICER. But really, they're individuals. And maybe if you look at, you could have had different messages almost in the same 5 minutes that we had. Just a thought.
It's a really interesting thought tactically. It doesn't completely answer the question of what we like to see ICER do differently, unless it's put out much more information on who the members are before the meeting. But I think it's a really interesting question. You're right. We are talking to audience. Tony's point is audience should be more sensitive. Your point is, however sensitive the audience is, figure out where they live and hit them there.
Yeah, I would go with that.
I think if I was wanting ICER to alter anything, it would be where they look at being supportive of empathetic. And empathy can be split into different areas. They don't have to. They've got a process that has to be relatively black and white, and I can understand that. What I got a sense of is they at least need a cognitive empathy where they understand that other people have a different perspective to their own and take that into account. They don't have to deliver a totally empathetic response, but they do have to understand the perspectives that each of the individuals who suffer from the disease come with, and that can be so heterogeneous. So I'd just like them to spend a little bit more time understanding that perspective, because I think it's where we started the conversation about the lack of empathy that was felt by the patient groups. It's really important. If you can't engage the population and the community you're aiming to be treating or advising treatment within, then it's really, really difficult to get any traction and a fundamental respect for that process. And I haven't got a sense of full respect for their process, which is a shame if you want to do something.
So I think because Tony and I tend to be at least semi-proud of being data geeky, I'm going to give a very data geeky answer. Bad data produces bad results. And so much knowledge has been gained in this field in the last 3 or 4 years that to use papers and insights that were 4 or 5 years old, which is what people tend to do because they've quote unquote stood the test of time, that's fine. But if in fact standing the test of time means you're the only thing that stood up in a hurricane, and hurricanes things are supposed to blow over. And we know so much more than we knew then. And the numbers have moved and the insights have moved. And nobody says non-progressive anymore. And virtually nobody says a quarter of the population anymore. So when I said this the last time we recorded it, when those are the first two things you see, you immediately go, the data inputs are not going to produce the right result because they're not the right data inputs. And in both those numbers speak to far less urgency to get it right now and to do the incremental bold thing now as compared to wait for a perfect result, right? If it's the less of a population has a disease, the less progressive it is, the less symptomatic it is, the less I have to worry about being urgent today. So all the data of the last 4 years has suggested the need for far greater urgency. And with urgency, by the way, comes empathy. And the use of non-urgent old data, I think, was a real mistake. I would advocate in situations like this that people have different processes for deciding what data they're going to use to build their models. And that instead of erring on the side of the thing that has quote unquote stood the test of time, take the most recent thing that organizations support. Because if you look at the studies that you use to drive the guidelines of the 4 organizations that come up with guidelines in the last year, much more recent data, much more sensitive to disease. And I think if they had started there, and if they're true to purpose, they might have gotten to at least a somewhat different result. They certainly would have had a broader lens through which to look at the issue. Tony, that's the data geek in me. I have several answers, but that's, if you start with bad numbers, you can't get it right. With that as a thought, I want to thank you folks for pulling this together on fairly short notice. I want to thank you for your involvement last time. We will be covering the advisory committee on the 19th, not in person necessarily, on webcast and doing a follow-up podcast right after that. I think that's going to be really an interesting day, hey, in 2.5 weeks. Wayne, Tony, Mike, Louise, thanks for your time. Louise, safe flight on Sunday. And I look forward to seeing all of you soon. Bye-bye.
And now for the Season 4, Episode 19 Business Report.
Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava, glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes. Today, stories about the spring 2023 Ukraine counteroffensive were bumped from the front line of Ukraine news by the allegation that somehow Ukrainian forces engineered 2 drones to fly into the Kremlin last night and then spectacularly failed to reach Putin. Except for Russian news services and political leaders, I haven't seen a source today that provides this story with a shred of credence. Propaganda is as propaganda does, but even by those standards, this one feels fishy and a bit contrived. Slava Ukraini.
Our plans for the EASL Congress are taking shape.
This week, we are proud to announce that we will serve once again as media partners for the 2023 EASL Congress in Vienna, June 22nd to 24th. As I said in my groundbreaker, this package will include 5 or 6 episodes with previews, day-to-day coverages, and follow-ups. Louise will be in Australia during that session, but Jorn and I will be on the ground in Vienna, accompanied by a raft of key opinion leaders and patient advocates. Keep listening for details as we go forward.
April downloads are down from March, but that's not a surprise.
March had momentum and fantastic episodes. April started with an episode that posted 48 hours late and a lineup that included no major science or drug development blockbusters. So content was down from last month, but 50% higher than it was the last time we had a month with this kind of content, which was last December. May and June have some fantastic subjects, so I anticipate things will rebound quickly.
Keep an eye out and calendar time open for the 3rd week in May.
As I mentioned during this episode, we plan to cover the FDA Advisory Committee on Obeticholic acid in real time on Friday, May 19th, with the podcast recording right after the end of that session and posting sometime on Saturday. That week starts with our first EASL Congress 2023 preview episode, so it'll be a rich week for podcast content.
This week's Vault conversation should help whet your appetite for May 19th.
This week's Vault episode comes from last July, Season 3, Episode 36.5, in which Stephen, Jorn, Louise, and I discussed Intercept Pharmaceuticals' release of the reanalysis and augmentation of the Regenerate trial for F3 fibrosis. It was our first look at whether this data would be robust enough to get OCA over the finish line, the exact question we'll all hear more about on May 19th. So with that, I'm off for another week. Thanks to today's patient advocate panel for excellent contributions, and to Jake, Magic Mike, Steve, and Eric for helping get this episode out the door. We're still sorting out next week, but everything from then through the end of June is already scheduled. We have 2 ideas for next week, both of which are interesting and challenging. So come back and listen. Until then, make sure to let us know how you feel about Rising Tide. Don't forget to send reviews. Stay safe. Surf on. We'll see you next week on the podcast. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to surfingnash.com, and we will answer on the podcast or the website.